Russia's war in Ukraine, now in its 4th year, has revealed Russia to be a chronic threat, and we see in the future it will be a growing threat, one that is willing to use military force to achieve its geopolitical goals and is today actively waging a campaign of destabilization across Europe and beyond. Further exacerbating this threat from Russia are the deepening partnerships among our adversaries, Iran, the Communist Chinese Party, the DPRK, and Russia itself, and these are increasingly posing a global risk. But U.S. EUCOM and the NATO alliance have arisen to the challenge. NATO deterrence has held. War has not spilled into NATO territory. With support from a broad international coalition, U.S. European Command led the charge in helping Ukraine. We established Security Assistance Group Ukraine, now commanded by Lieutenant General Curtis Buzzard. And for 38 months of this war, SAGU has delivered critical munitions, arms, and equipment from the U.S. and our allies to the Ukrainians. These efforts have been indispensable in enabling the Ukrainian armed forces, and they have empowered them to mount a courageous defense. And now NATO has taken up this task as well, establishing record time and organization to take over much of SAGU's mission. The threat of war has also led the NATO alliance to embark upon an historic campaign to fundamentally overhaul and modernize its military capabilities. After years of underinvestment, too many years, our allies are finally optimizing the alliance for high-end war fighting. And within NATO, we now have the plans, the command and control, and increasingly the forces, and we have the focus to meet that mission. And while there's still much to do, our allies are investing at a rate we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War, a 40% increase in spending since February of 2022. And throughout this intense and challenging transformation, the presence of U.S. EUCOM forces has been essential to the alliance's modernization efforts. We've converged U.S. headquarters with NATO command structures. We've increased combined training and exercises, and we've been accelerating European modernization and readiness. Through U.S. leadership, we are laying the groundwork for European leadership, and thus for more years of peace and prosperity for the United States of America. It's a long road ahead, and a sustained vigilance and pressure will be required, but we will get there. This has been to protect vital U.S. interests. Our strengthened allies will increase our strength, and our deep relationships give us the access, the basing, and the intelligence necessary to do this. The first line of defense of our homeland begins in EUCOM, where our naval forces prevent Russian submarines from breaking out into the Atlantic. U.S. ballistic missile defense of Israel starts with EUCOM ships positioned in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it's our job in EUCOM safely to evacuate Americans from the Levant. We are America's force forward in the world. So as the chairman and the ranking member noted, ladies and gentlemen, this is my last annual testimony to you as I'm closing 38 years of service this summer. It's been really the honor of a lifetime to serve with our brilliant service members during these historic times. I continue to be inspired by their commitment to our nation's forward defense. And I thank you, the Congress, for your unwavering support to our servicemen and women, to their well-being, and to their vital mission. America is the greatest country in the world, and it is in large part because of our armed forces, which are the finest in the world. I look forward to your questions. So if we start in the northern part of the battlefield, the active battlefield area, that's the place where Ukraine last summer pushed an advance into Russia in an area called Kursk. And they took a large part of Kursk. This is where the Russians introduced North Korean troops to help push the Ukrainians back out. They set an original goal of the end of September to have the Ukrainians out of Kursk. The Ukrainians today are still in Kursk. There is a sizable force holding a sizable, diminished, but sizable chunk of ground inside Russia in Kursk Oblast right now, and they're holding on very good defensive terrain. South of there, in Belgorod, the Ukrainians a couple of weeks ago pushed a smaller counteroffensive back into Russia. So we still have a back and forth going up in that area. If we come down inside of Ukraine to some of the big battlefields up in Luhansk, and first of all, there's the city just west of the old Bakhmut called Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians and the Russians have been fighting over this city and the city to the south of it, Toretsk, for about 8 months now. In recent weeks, the Russian offensives have sort of petered out. They had been decreasing in scale, moving from company size to platoon size, now basically small groups of infantrymen trying to rush forward under artillery fire, and they have failed to gain ground in the last couple of weeks. In fact, the Ukrainians have taken a little bit of ground back from them. If we come farther south from that, we get to Pokrovsk in Donetsk province, where the Russians continue to try to take Pokrovsk. They are stalled out on their axes trying to encircle it. They got pretty close, but the Ukrainians have held the Russians back. That's on the ground. The Russians seem to be suffering from a paucity of armored vehicles and a lack of manpower. The Ukrainians on their side have assumed very strong defensive positions, well dug in, and appear to have solved some of their manpower problems that were so acute last autumn. They've increased the pool of people available for mobilization. They've increased the pool of people available for voluntary recruitment, and they've done a good job squeezing people out of headquarters to the front. If we look in other domains, both sides are relying on long-range attack. The Russians largely with cruise missiles and glide bombs, and the Ukrainians are relying mainly on one-way attack drones, as well as some indigenously produced cruise missile systems, one in particular that I've got in mind that we could talk about in closed session, sir. Ukrainians depend on us principally, uniquely, I should say, for their high-end anti-aircraft systems. So the things that shoot down the ballistic missiles and the long-range attack missiles that the Russians throw at them almost daily, that is mainly supplied by the United States. That would have an obvious effect. If the Ukrainians were not able to receive intelligence from us, they would struggle to target, especially in depth, operational level targets such as command post, logistics areas, and things like that, which require a specific you've got to have very good intelligence to do that, and they would struggle to do that. I do have to note that the Ukrainians have developed alternative sources. Many of our allies have stepped up their ability to produce things for the Ukrainians. Czechia this month is delivering more than 70,000 rounds of 155. So there are some real advances. There's some diversification of their supply sources, but undoubtedly the Ukrainians are very dependent on our assistance.
Through how command and control of U.S. nuclear forces in Europe works today, including your role.
Absolutely, Senator. So to keep it at a very open level, the United States has always offered a certain amount of nuclear force to NATO to be employed by SAC here. So we have some nuclear weapons that in a conflict, upon the agreement of the United States and the rest of the nations, would be turned over to SAC here to be delivered by a variety of nations who are involved in this program, all of them NATO nations. That all happens under the command and control of SACIR. If SACIR were not an American officer, we would have to find some other way to do that, and it would certainly not be as integrated with the rest of SACIR's operations as it is now. So, yeah, I basically, as the American commander, have those weapons in my possession, and at the time of need, as instructed, I would pass them to myself as the Supreme Allied Commander to employ in accordance with the 32 nations.
It sounds to me like the way the command works right now, we don't have a middleman involved in this. It would be you as an American commander in consultation with the president, the commander-in-chief, who could, I believe, more easily and also with more knowledge make decisions affecting the use of our nuclear weapons. Would you say that's correct assumption
yes,
on my part?
That's correct, because I am able to rehearse these procedures, both in the American system. I work very closely with General Cotton, for instance, from U.S. Stratcom. We can rehearse those procedures on a U.S. basis. We rehearse the delivery procedures on a NATO basis, and I and key American elements of my staff at the NATO headquarters, at Supreme Allied Headquarters Europe, we are able to be the link in that chain that makes it seamless.
Thank you. The GIUK gap, sir. It's always been a critical maritime choke point, but it has recently grown in its strategic importance to NATO in light of the increase we're seeing with Russian submarine patrols in the Atlantic. What do you see, General, as the largest challenges with respect to the GIUK gap?
The biggest challenge is there, ma'am, at an unclassified level, just the quantity of stuff we have, the quantity of equipment and the quantity of forces we have available to monitor the underwater activity there and to counter it. It's important to understand that the U.S. has a unique role here. We have capabilities that our allies do not have. They have capabilities in numbers that we need to augment ours, so we work very closely together, but the U.S. component of those efforts is absolutely fundamental. We've learned an awful lot. First of all, I should point out that early on in the conflict, all of the services and the Joint Force established a variety of cells and organizations deliberately to study the lessons of the conflict. And we've had everything from publications about it to seminars on it at a classified and unclassified level. And we have learned an awful lot. Some of the things that we have gained as a military are well, they're technical, they're procedural, and they're sort of large-scale operations focused. So technically, for example, we have learned an awful lot about Russian measures and countermeasures and how to counter countermeasures, a lot of technical stuff. We've seen a lot of growth in both the Russian capability and the Ukrainian capability in electromagnetic warfare, electronic warfare, and we have learned from that, and we have modified many of our procedures. I think you're familiar with the U.S. Army's Transformation and Contact Initiative. That is really based on lessons learned from Ukraine. As a short example, our use of drones has changed deeply across the Joint Force. Before this conflict in the U.S. Army, for example, we had very few but large drones associated with large units. Now we're proliferating smaller drones to smaller units and having a larger number of drones in lower and lower hands. Fundamental change in the way we're doing business. There are many, many other technical and tactical lessons we've learned. At a meta level, sir, I would say some of the big lessons we've learned are about scale. The scale of this conflict is just awe-inspiring. Thousands of tanks destroyed on both sides. The Russians have lost more than 4,000 tanks, which is the inventory almost of the United States tank corps. So the need for replacement, for depth of magazine, for resilience, all these are lessons that we're learning, and I believe the services are programming it as the years go forward. So we've learned a lot.
Before you continue, in February of 22, we would not have dreamed of such a loss from Russia of tanks, would we?
We would not have. I did not anticipate the war to go this long, and I did not anticipate Ukraine to be able to destroy so much of Russia's warfighting capability.
I hope I didn't break your train of thought, so continue.
No, so as we watch the Russians, we see that their level of skill in some technical areas is very high and is evolving during the course of the war, but it's mainly isolated in specific pockets. It does not appear to be generalizable across the force, and overall the quality of their force, especially their ground force, has been decreasing throughout the conflict. On the Ukrainian side, we see sort of the opposite. We see a military that started pretty much from an almost cold start. We had been helping them before the war, but not at the scale we began to after the war, and they've evolved and developed very, very quickly. So we've learned a lot about institutional adaptation from watching both sides.
General Cavoli, it appears that the Russians and President Putin are engaged in what they consider a kind of waiting game, a grinding down in the conflict in Ukraine. Are the Ukrainians destined to lose?
No, Senator. Thank you for the question, because I think it's an important one. There's nothing inevitable in war. And the Ukrainians are in very strong defensive positions right now and are improving weekly their ability to generate force and to reinforce those positions. It is hard sitting here right now to envision a major Ukrainian offensive that clears everybody, out of every square inch of Ukraine. But likewise, it's very hard to envision Ukraine collapsing and losing that conflict. I do not think there's an inevitability to a Ukrainian loss.
And a follow-up question, and you touched on this in answers to Senator Brown's. Describe the Ukrainians' evolution of their force over the course of this conflict. My sense is they've really gone, as I think you mentioned, Minutemen with a rifle to a really serious modern military force.
Yeah, absolutely, Senator. So in the beginning, they had a certain number of organized brigades in the east. But what really kicked in was sort of volunteers who spontaneously came in, organized under officer leadership. General Syrski north of Kiev was key in stopping that advance toward Hostomel and then back out, pushing the Russians out of Bucha. They evolved from that. They consolidated that into Soviet-style brigades, which they were used to, with Soviet equipment. And then coming through late 22 and 23, we could see that equipment, and especially their artillery ammunition of a Soviet caliber, was going to be exhausted. And so we had to help them convert to a largely Western-equipped and almost exclusively Western artillery-equipped force, which is pretty complicated. We operate off of a different aiming circle.
They've been effective in making that transition.
It's amazing to do that under fire, under the pressure of one of the world's largest armies. It's a fantastic feat.
Let me change the subject entirely for a minute. Please discuss Russian and Chinese activities in the Arctic and the risks in the Arctic. It strikes me that this is a looming threat area that we should be addressing. And I should mention the reason it's becoming so important is the melting of the Arctic ice, which has something to do with climate change. 70% of the Arctic ice has disappeared in the last 40 years. So talk to me about the strategic importance of the Arctic.
Absolutely, Senator. So from the U.S. perspective, the most important thing to understand is the shortest distance from Russian airfields to the United States is over the polar cap.
And they are building up those airfields, are they not?
They are. They were before the war at a fast pace. It's slowed down a little bit during the war, but they're still opening airfields and repairing existing ones. The other thing that comes out of the Arctic, sir, the Northern Fleet in Murmansk comes up, sails down through the GI-UK gap and breaks out, or tries to break out into the Atlantic, from which they can hold key U.S. targets at risk with sub-launch cruise missiles, among other weapons.
So we should be paying particular attention to the Arctic as a new domain, if you will, of potential conflict.
And I think we are. The U.S. Northern Command, so General Guillot, has the primary U.S. responsibility for it. But of course, Strategic Command also has activities up there. EUCOM has activities up there because so much of the Arctic is in my AOR. And NATO, of course, almost all of the nations in the Arctic Council are NATO nations. The only one that's not is Russia. So we've recently been sponsoring tabletop exercises to make sure we understand the details of command and control and coordination of operations there.
Talk a little bit about the importance of what Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are doing, in contrast to, historically at least, maybe Germany is finally going to show up and do their part. But can you talk about the importance of what they're doing along the eastern flank, and then in contrast to what the lack of investment that Germany's made in the past, and the importance of what these countries on the eastern flank are doing?
Sure, Senator. It's a great opportunity to talk about some of our allies, some of our newer allies, right? These are not plank owners. These are post-Warsaw Pact allies of the United States. Poland's at 4.7% of GDP, right? As a benchmark, we are at about 3.4%. So this is a country that has had very rapid economic growth sustained over the last 15 years and is committing it to correct an imbalance in their defensive capability. They're buying vast quantities of U.S. equipment, by the way, but more important, they're integrating it with the alliance, and they're making it available to the alliance for collective defense, which is fantastic. They are rapidly becoming the bulwark of our ground defenses on the eastern flank, and their officer corps is stepping up to the task as well. If we come up through Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, every single one of those countries has come above 2%. Estonia is headed over 3%. Two of the three countries have reintroduced at least limited conscription. They are building defensive fortifications, and they have extremely well integrated national defense plans with our NATO defense plans. Very, very active. I spend quite a bit of time there working with them on their plans. Finland, of course, Finland never looked away from its national defense requirements throughout years and years and years since the Winter War of 1939, and they have happily and seamlessly and quickly integrated their defense plans into our NATO defense plans. And in fact, they're contributing a 3-star land component command to handle the potential ground fight in the high north for us. So very grateful to those countries.
You want to talk about Germany?
Germany has performed as an ally for many decades, sir. During the Cold War, we know how strong they were. They, like many other nations in the alliance, took a holiday from readiness and force sizing, and they're trying to correct that. It's a complicated situation politically, but I believe that Herr Merz, Friedrich Merz, has been able to negotiate as part of a future coalition. He'll be the future chancellor. He's been able to negotiate at long last an agreement to be able to use deficit spending to be able to finance more rapid growth, and we look forward to having that happen. They have very solid plans for expansion and for modernization. We just need to see it get going.
If you were placing troops around the NATO alliance, American troops without any past, where would you move troops? If you didn't have to worry about existing physical structures, things like that?
Ultimately, what we would like to see is sufficiently robust national forces to be the basis of the defense of any part of the eastern flank. In some places, that's hard to see because just the nations are not large enough, the Baltic nations, for instance. The second thing we'd like to see in those places is a reinforcement by a multinational alliance force. We have that in the 3 Baltic countries. We would like to use U.S. forces to be able to deploy rapidly from on the continent responsively to the point of need. One of the differences between the Cold War and now is we were very sure where the battlefield would be during the Cold War. Now we have, 2,300 kilometers of expanse. The U.S. forces bring capabilities that nobody else has and can move the fastest, so I need them in locations where they can be trained, ready, and where they have the infrastructure and the political agreements, the international agreements, to be able to deploy quickly from.
All right. Thank you. Thank both of you for your service.
Thank you, sir.
Is Ukraine from this time last year winning this war against Russia?
They're in a much better position not to lose it, Senator Tuberville. They have shored up their defenses. They've assumed very strong defenses, and they've improved their force generation capability. So they're in a much better position than they were. Depending on what the objective is, of course, which has always been the question in this chamber as well as others, it would be hard for them to accomplish some things, but they're doing a good job of what they're trying to do now, which is hold their line.
But they're trying to win, right?
They're trying to win. They want to start by making sure Russia doesn't win.
Yeah. Status of the F-16s that we've sent? I know it's not classified because Russia obviously knows what's happened to them.
No, there are a number of F-16s in there. There are a number of pilots in there. There are more F-16s prepared to be deployed in there. There are more pilots in the training pipeline, sir. I can give you the numbers in closed session. They are active. The planes are active, and they fly every day. They've defeated a large number of cruise missile threats, and they've delivered an awful lot of offensive attacks as well, specifically bombing attacks in the east. None of the F-16s has been from the U.S., though. They've mainly been from Northern European countries, Netherlands, Denmark.
Status for Patriot systems that we've had there for several years?
Yep, they are up and running, sir. I can tell you exactly in closed session, but that has been, in my mind, a success story. Frankly, I was just a little bit dubious in the beginning. It's a complicated system. We train guys for a long, long time to be able to operate it. The Ukrainians put their best people against it and took to it like a fish to water. And in fact, we learned from some of their employment techniques right now.
How effective have the long-range missiles that we've allowed Ukrainians to shoot into Russia, how effective has that been?
Very.
In all areas?
Yeah, they've been extremely effective, sir. I could go into this in private session, but the United States makes some very good weaponry, and it's the ones we've donated have been very, very effective. In closed session, I'd be happy to talk to you about a few of the things they've done with it.
So, where do you think what's the status of Kursk as we speak today? After they've gone in, and obviously there's been a lot of battles, a lot of people killed, a lot of prisoners taken. Where does that stand?
There is a Ukrainian force that is holding on inside Kursk Oblast, inside Russia. They've got quite a bit of terrain. I'd give it to you in closed session, sir, and how many troops, but they've got a sizable force there, and they maintain a well-defended piece of terrain there. They've also augmented it with some terrain they recently captured just a few kilometers in Belgorod, just south of there.
So they gave up some, now they're taking it back? Is that what you're saying?
That's correct. They've taken a little back farther south.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your service.
Voli, the Russians are nowhere near capable of making a big push right now, are they?
That is my assessment, Chairman.
Okay, and what nationality are the pilots of those F-16s?
They're Ukrainian.
Okay, and where were they trained?
They were trained in a variety of places, some in Romania, some in the Netherlands, some in Arizona.
Thank you very much. I think we have Senator Slotkin now.
Thank you, Chairman. Generals, thank you for being here and for your really significant service to the country. We appreciate you. I'm sure you're not crying any tears that this may be your last hearing in front of this committee, but we're happy to have you. And General Cavoli, I can't think of a general more associated with Americans' response to the invasion of Ukraine than you, given the role as SACEUR that you've been playing for these last number of years. Just to establish a baseline, you said at the Aspen Security Forum that supporting Ukraine is vital for American security. Can you confirm that you still believe that that is correct?
I do believe that, yes, ma'am.
And you also said that Russia was, no matter what, no matter how this war concludes, was still going to be a big problem. Do you believe that after Russia invaded Georgia, then Crimea, then eastern Ukraine, that if some sort of deal was reached with Vladimir Putin, especially one that advantaged him, that he'd be done with invading neighboring countries, that he would be done with adventurism in Europe?
I do not, ma'am. My professional assessment, based on years of study, is that this is part of a broader pattern in Russian history and certainly in current Russian activity. How the U.S. oriented against that is not my call,
of course,
but that is my assessment of their threat.
Based on your experience on the ground and having to negotiate, again, military to military with the Russians and others, do you believe that the Russians are a trustworthy negotiating partner?
I believe they are. I believe they are a very deliberate negotiating partner. I believe they are very strategic in their negotiations, even over small tactical things that I've been involved in over the years. And I believe they're highly proficient at it, and they will always chase their interests.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk about how the relationship between Russia and China has evolved over the course of this war? Is it safe to say that since the war in Ukraine, Russia has become the biggest provider to China of military technology and equipment?
They have certainly increased the amount they provide. I'm not a China expert, so I'm not sure who exactly the biggest is. And in closed session, we can talk a little bit about what exactly they've been providing. One of the things in reverse, though, Senator, frequently I get asked, what sort of support is China providing Russia? And I think one of the most pernicious types of support they provide is moral support to Russia, because it justifies the violation of another country's sovereignty, which I think is highly problematic were it to become widespread.
Yeah, I mean, just in open source, we can find that Moscow is helping Beijing develop submarine, aeronautic, and missile technologies in exchange for China's, as you say, moral support for Russia's war, maybe other things beyond moral support. And even though this administration has had very little to say about China's military role and about this partnership as they try and negotiate with Russia, and despite the Pentagon's new national defense strategy, which says that they're focused on China, we really don't see a lot of visibility on this pernicious topic, which is an alliance stronger than ever, or a relationship at least stronger than ever between China and Russia. Is Russia helping China develop military capabilities that could impact the United States?
Again, in closed session, we could talk about it, but they're certainly cooperating not for the benefit of the United States.
Right, but I mean, China, they can have other interests in other countries, but I think we are a primary focus for the Chinese military. I don't think that's a classified statement in any way. Do you believe that the Chinese are watching what we do in Europe, in Ukraine, and with Russia, and learning lessons that they may use when it comes to potentially taking over Taiwan?
They are.
Do you believe, what are the lessons then that you think they're learning from this, watching us in this conflict, as we now quickly move to negotiate with Putin, put a lot of trust in him, in the person that invaded a democracy? Do you think it makes them more likely or less likely to go ahead and try and take Taiwan?
Ma'am, I think they're learning lessons at every echelon, one of them being the policy-making and decision-making echelon. I'll leave that to others to comment on. But at the military level, operationally and tactically, they're studying the conflict very, very hard in ways that we know they would apply to their to any potential conflict in Taiwan.
Again, thank you for your service, your long service, both of you, and I yield back to whoever is acting as chairman. Okay, there we go.
I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Germany is the biggest economy in Europe, twice the GDP of Russia. But it's also been the biggest free rider in NATO for decades. They've finally reached 2% of GDP on defense by some metrics, but they're still not a very capable force. Germany promised in 2023 to deploy an armored brigade to Lithuania, and that brigade isn't going to be fully operational until 2027. It takes the nation that once fielded hundreds of divisions 4 years to move a single brigade just a few hundred miles away from Germany. General Cavoli, the Europeans are finally starting to spend more on their defense, but how long is it going to take before their spending turns into real capability?
Thanks, Senator. This is a very important question because we have been waiting a long time to get the levels of defense spending we're starting to see. Now there's got to be something to buy. So we have a lot of countries, 23 nations, budgeting over 2% this year, several going over 3%. I believe the number 6 are over 3% this year. Now it's a matter of converting it into hardware and organizations. And our industrial base, both in Russia and on this side of the Atlantic, is struggling to produce the relevant equipment and the quantities needed. So basically, there's more money available than stuff right now, sir. I think
Why?
Well, our defense industrial bases on both sides of the Atlantic consolidated and atrophied under lack of orders. And then there are some bureaucratic problems in governments in terms of acquiring stuff so that it goes slowly. But I think this question of the elasticity of our defense industrial base, again, on both sides of the Atlantic, is one of the great strategic questions of the next 10, 15 years.
Got it. The German defense minister last year said that Germany needed to move towards spending 3% of its GDP or more on defense. Do you think the Germans are serious about spending that much on their military?
Yeah, I think they are, Senator. And the reason I say that is because Friedrich Merz was just elected as the next chancellor in Germany, and very rapidly he, sort of outlined the next coalition that he's going to be leading, and they came to an agreement to do a massive increase in defense spending, far beyond the 100 billion euros they talked about a couple of years ago. And the way they got there was by releasing the so-called debt brake that prevented Germany from assuming deficit spending. So they have exempted defense spending from the debt brake. This is an historic breakthrough for them, and it is the thing that's going to allow them to apply their rather prodigious economic resources to defense. They have a very strong plan to modernize and to expand. It's exactly in accordance with what I need as the Supreme Allied Commander, and I'm very eager to see this coalition.
Feel like they're collaborating with you on that plan?
Absolutely, sir.
Good. How much would it strengthen your hand if all of our NATO allies increase their spending on defense up to 3%?
Sir, I don't think you've ever met a general who wants less defense spending among the force providers. It would help a great deal.
It would strengthen your hand. It would help.
Absolutely, and we're eager to see it come to pass, and we're especially eager to see it turn into real capability, which is going to require some improvements in our industrial capacity.
It's clear that the United States should redeploy more of its units in Europe to the Pacific. But I also want to make sure that we do that in the right way. General, what U.S. capabilities are our European allies least capable of replacing right now?
Yeah, they're least capable of replacing high-end air and missile defense on a large basis. They depend on us for significant intelligence collection, processing, exploitation, and dissemination. They depend on us for deep, long-range fires. They depend on us for aerial command and control for large-scale campaigns. They depend on us for the backbone of certain parts of command and control. Those are really the key things. There are a few things else that I'd like to go into closed session, sir.
What capabilities can our European allies where are they most prepared to take over from us?
Well, right now they do a variety of things without us, right? So today I believe it's 17 or 20 European ships, NATO ships turned over to my command as SACEUR. Normally, military forces are held by the nations, and then they turn it over to me for particular operations. I have 0 U.S. ships working for me as SACEUR right now. I have only 40 individual human beings, Marines, who are participating in the operation to monitor the Baltic Sea. We call it Baltic Sentry. Everything is being done by our European allies in those cases. So they have a variety of things they can do for us in any one of those areas. One of the most important things they do provide is intelligence. While we have exquisite capability to collect, they have very deep understanding of their regions, and they have some capabilities that we struggle to match in that regard. And those intel sharing relationships, sir, are based on a broader relationship that we cultivate very carefully.
Thank you.
American priorities in Europe, what they should be. Let's stop confusing symbolism with strategy. And while we're at it, maybe let's stop waving foreign flags in the House floor when Americans can barely afford groceries. Some of my colleagues seem to think that defending Ukraine matters more than defending our own border. I disagree, and so do the American people. It's time to have a serious realignment. Let Europe grow up and carry its own weight. America's job is not to babysit the world. It's to protect our people and our interests. Full stop. General Cavoli, I had a bunch of questions for you, but I had to say what I had to say. So I guess since I'm the chairman, I'll ask one question right now. Greenland. Can you just talk about the strategic importance and why that matters to the United States of America?
Sure, I'll talk about it from my perspective as...
Yeah, not from a policy perspective, from a military perspective.
But from a military perspective, Senator, I'll limit my comments to my field of expertise, which is the European theater, right? EUCOM AOR and the SACEUR AOR. The key there is it forms the western border of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, which is that body of water through which Russian submarines from the Northern Fleet in Murmansk come up and then down through that gap. And once they get past that gap, they break out into the Atlantic. It becomes very tough to track them. It's a vast expanse. There are some acoustic things about the underwater geography that make it pretty tough. From those positions that they can achieve, they can hold the U.S. homeland at risk, several important targets with land attack cruise missiles. Greenland is the western boundary of that gap. So my access to it, the airspace and water space bounding Greenland, is absolutely critical.
Russia's ability to recoup its material and personnel losses in Ukraine, will it succeed in rebuilding after its losses, and what kind of threat does that represent to American security interests?
Sure, Senator, thank you. So if we divide Russia's rebuilding capability into two big blocks, personnel and equipment, I believe the personnel they'll be able to build as quickly as they want to. They continue to maintain a conscription. You saw that just last week, the Russian government announced its annual conscription drive. It increased by 10,000 over last year, 160,000 this year. With those numbers, they will be able to constitute the force size that they choose fairly quickly. Be a little tougher, take them a little bit more time to organize it into the sort of organizations that they have said they want to build after the war. They want to have an army of about 1.5 million, they've announced. They want to put a lot of it on the border of NATO and northeastern Europe. It'll take them a little bit of time to do that, but we're talking a couple of years. Equipment, that depends on how much more they lose inside Ukraine, sir. They've lost a vast amount of equipment inside Ukraine. They started the war with someplace near 13,000 tanks on active and in storage, and they're starting to approach near the end of that, near the end of the useful tanks in storage. So depending on how much more they lose, that will really determine how quickly they can regenerate. They have expanded their capability to produce some things, artillery shells, cruise missiles, tremendously. And they're producing some things such as one-way attack drones in prodigious numbers that they weren't even producing at all before the war.
And I would characterize that capability as offensive. In other words, they're not defending against a possible invasion from Ukraine. They are preparing for continuing offensive actions against Ukraine and possibly NATO allies if they are successful in Ukraine.
And I would add to that, Senator, that this is not just in the ground domain. They have long-range aviation that practices daily, moving out and doing strikes across North America. They have their strategic ballistic missile fleet, their road mobiles that are constantly out there, and they have their submarine fleet that's constantly out there. So it's not just in those domains. And then there is, of course, the cyber domain, in which they're very active. We can talk about in closed session, sir.
Just one last question, General, because I've heard from some of the critics of our military aid to Ukraine that there are significant numbers of weapons embezzled, stolen, missing from the aid that we're providing Ukraine. On every one of the visits, I've been to Ukraine 6 times now, I've talked to our military and logistics folks in Poland, and they are tracking virtually every bullet that we have provided to Ukraine, and there's no evidence whatsoever of this kind of misconduct or misappropriation of our aid to Ukraine. Would you agree?
Yeah, I do agree with that, Senator. There will be a challenge locating all of it later. All of us have been in combat, realize that it's pretty easy to misplace things and to lose track of things. But we've seen no deliberate effort to transfer, sell, or steal weaponry. The Ukrainians are using it to defend their country.
My hope is that Russia will take seriously the efforts to peace and stop stonewalling and slow walking negotiation, but right now they seem to be playing us and playing for time. And I want to thank you again for your incredible service, both of you, to our great country. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
The Russian organized referendums in 2022 in so-called overwhelming Russian-speaking provinces. General Cavoli, tell us what you know and what you understand about the freedom of those organized referendums and the accuracy of them as a measure of public opinion.
Sure, Mr. Chairman. I don't think I'm familiar with the voices in Washington that are talking about this, but I do remember them very well. They were referendums in Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson provinces. They were in September 2022. They were roundly condemned by nations throughout the world and by international organizations. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe called them illegitimate. The United Nations called them illegal. I think the only country in the world that accepted the result of those referenda, other than Russia, was North Korea. So they have widely been considered not to be legitimate for a variety of reasons about the way they took place and taking place during a conflict by an occupying power.
So if members of Congress want to be informed by what happened in these referenda, if our negotiators in this peace process want to be informed by these referenda, what lesson should we take from the legitimacy of those votes?
Sir, I think that anybody who wants to know about it, it's pretty well established history. It's pretty easy to find. I could certainly help direct your colleagues or anybody you want to sources on it. What conclusions can we draw? We can draw the conclusion that, the Russian Federation was intent on absorbing those provinces and attempted to put a gloss of legitimacy over it by holding a referenda that had, results like 99% in favor.
Rigged results, correct?
That was the widespread conclusion at the time in 2022. Yes, sir.
And also, since you are a student of the Russian language yourself, is the fact that the Russian language is spoken in part of Ukraine, is that demonstrative of their loyalty with regard to their nationality?
Well, we see linguistic minorities in countries all over the world, sir. There certainly is a dominant Russian language population in eastern Ukraine. We see a Russian language population in eastern Estonia. So it's
they consider themselves loyal Estonians, do they not?
Yeah, it really doesn't have much to do with sovereignty at all. I mean, we have large populations in our country that don't speak English.
That's the point I was trying to make. Senator Reid, we'll be going into a closed session. Do you have any questions for the open session?
I have a few questions, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Cavoli, in your military opinion, does the U.S. agreement with Denmark to facilitate access and basing needs in Greenland meet current military requirements?
Sir, I can only talk about the part of the military requirements that affect me. So our principal presence on Greenland, the United States personal presence on Greenland is the base at Pitafik in northwestern Greenland. That is not under my operational or administrative control. That's a Space Force base. And I don't know if it's adequate for them or not. From my perspective, as both the Supreme Allied Commander and the U.S. European Command Commander, I have all the access and basing I need to prosecute the operations that we've talked about in the High North during this.
So that, from your perspective, European Greenland, just to get the facts right, is within your area of operations.
Greenland is within my area of operations as the Supreme Allied Commander, and it is within my area of operations as the U.S. European Command Commander.
And you feel at this juncture we have all the capacity we need to confront the threats going forward?
Yeah, again, Senator, my part of that is what I can comment on. That's from the coast of Greenland eastward and northward to counter Russian threats coming out of there. I can't really speak for Northcom's interests or anything like that.
Thank you. If AFRICOM is dissolved and merged into EUCOM, you would have a responsibility for more than 50 countries. Do you have the capacity, the expertise, the infrastructure to
I would have the responsibility for 50 more countries.
Yes, exactly right.
It would be a stretch, Senator. I mean, that's a wide span of control. I think that the organization, if it were aggregated, would possess the expertise and the capacity, because when AFRICOM was created in 2007, it was mainly created by cleaving it out of the EUCOM headquarters and establishing it separate, actually in some cases in the exact same buildings. So my assumption would be that a lot of that capacity would have to come back to EUCOM in order to be able adequately to handle the threats and the problems that General Langley's talked about today. It would have to be studied very, very closely, of course.
Thank you. I have one question for General Langley and just a comment. We've talked a lot about the German contributions, and it's increasing, thank goodness. But I think we miss some of the history here. For many, many decades, Germany was divided, so that it's not the same country now that it was in the 1960s, et cetera, in terms of its economic capacity. And the second point that strikes me is that for many, many years after World War II, there was a great reluctance upon Germany, and indeed most other countries in the world, to see them create a powerful military force. We had seen that before, after World War I. And so I think that has to be factored into their reluctance to spend on defense. But now I think it's a turnaround, and they're putting a great deal of resources, as they should. Final question.